Everyone, and first of all, thank you all for coming in this sultry afternoon. This is our first Fellows Seminar, so it's we are starting this series where our senior fellows, research fellows, will be presenting their research to the wider audience outside ORF, and it's with great pleasure that we have Yhome's paper, who's a senior fellow in our neighborhood initiative. And I think this is something that perhaps a lot of you would find very interesting, given the scope of this paper, which deals with a topic which has great contemporary relevance. But he's also locating this in the larger scholarship on the subject, which is, I think, makes it quite an interesting read, both from policy perspective as well as from an academic perspective. And we have two discussants. I don't think we could have asked for better discussants to kick off the series. We have Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, who served in Myanmar and who knows a lot about the region and the country, and who will be sort of looking at the Myanmar aspect of this. And we have Professor Madhu, who comes from the China angle to this question. So we have two vantage points on which we will sort of deliberate this afternoon. And I also forgot to apologize because we are starting a bit late, but thank you for your patience. So without further ado, I will ask Yhome to present his findings, and then we'll invite the discussants.
Thank you, Chair. As the Chair has alluded, I think the paper that I've written and studied is one subject that it looks at Myanmar's domestic politics, its foreign relations with China, and also the implications of that relationship on Myanmar, and also in the region, and I particularly look at the implications on India. One of the key objectives that this study has looked at is what are the main factors or key geostrategic factors that have motivated China to respond to or to play a role in Myanmar's domestic ethnic conflicts. I actually want to start with something here. Before I go to the paper as such, I want to just give you a sense of the places and the players that I've looked at, I've studied in this paper. As you can see, on the north, the gray area is Yunnan province of China. It is from this region that in the 50s we have seen the Chinese Kuomintang groups enter into Myanmar and try to unsuccessfully invade Yunnan from Myanmar. Then we also saw in the 60s, 70s, 80s how the Chinese have supported the Communist Party of Burma, the CPB, which was there for decades, and a lot of these the cadres came from the ethnic groups along the China-Myanmar border. You have the Kokhan, you have the Wa, you have Mongla, you have Shang, and you have the Kachin. In fact, I think the yellow is the Kachin state, the green is the Shan, and of course the red is the Rakhine state. Now, if you look at some of the ethnic groups along this China-Myanmar border, you find the Kachins on the Myanmar side and the Kachins on the other side as well in China. They are called Jingfos there. Then you have also other ethnic groups along the border, such as the Wa. Again, you find them on the other side, and the Kokhan, who are ethnic Han Chinese and speak Mandarin. Now there are other smaller groups. All these groups, they have been fighting against the Myanmar government for decades. Now, if you go slightly south, I think the red, the Rakhine state, increasingly in the recent years, we have seen militarized conflicts on the rise there, involving the Arakan army, between the Arakan army and the Myanmar military. And of course, this is also the place where we have seen the unfolding of the Rohingya crisis there. So with this, a word on the research approach. If you look at the current literature on the issue, I think there are two broad frames in which this issue is examined. One is the border instability argument, which asserts that China's level of, the level of response on the Chinese, from the Chinese side is kind of proportionate to the intensity of conflict on the Myanmar side and its spillover effects on the Chinese side. Then the other argument is the nationalist pressure argument, which suggests that there's a linkage between foreign policy and Chinese domestic nationalist pressure. And they say that the Chinese have allowed nationalist pressure inside China to grow, or allowed it to fester so that it can take advantage of that to take a tough stand on Myanmar. Now, my sense is that these studies, while they give very interesting insights, they have not problematized the geostrategic issues in understanding the Chinese response in Myanmar ethnic conflicts. So one of the key objectives of this study is to fill this gap and to see what are the factors that have motivated China to play a role in Myanmar's domestic politics. As far as the scope is concerned, I've looked at from 2001 to 2018. The key question, as I said, is I've tried to look at what are the key motivating factors of China's response in Myanmar's conflicts. The key argument that I make here in this paper is that one of the key objectives I feel that the Chinese have responded to the ethnic conflicts in Myanmar is to regain some of the lost grounds, to play a more influential role that it had played in the past. And I think that's one of the drivers that has pushed the Chinese to play a role in the Myanmar conflicts. Now, if you look at the Chinese strategic interests in Myanmar, I think two factors are often highlighted. One is the border stability, and the other is access to the Indian Ocean. Now, while these two factors are important, again, I think in the current literature, I think what is not really substantially explored or examined is the geostrategic interests and concerns of China in the ethnic conflicts in Myanmar-China borderlands. Therefore, one of the area that I've looked at more closely is what are the factors, geostrategic factors that and concerns of China in the context of ethnic conflicts in the borderlands of China and Myanmar. One of the factors I think that China has been interested in, as far as geostrategic issues are concerned, is to play a more, a leading role, a more important role in the ethnic conflicts in Myanmar, as well as in the peace process of Myanmar. The other, again, I would say, is that China has been trying to use its role in the ethnic conflicts in Myanmar one is to earn the goodwill of Myanmar government, and also to use that to push some of its strategic interests in Myanmar. If you look at the Chinese response, I think one can roughly divide the Chinese response into three categories starting from 2011, based on the changes in its policies and strategies. Now, the first phase, I call it a confident China with limited interest in the borderlands. Why I say this is because, in the key concern during the early phase of, let's say in 2011, up till end of 2011, the Chinese interests appeared to be limited to the stability of the border regions and the concern of conflict spilling over to the Chinese side. So the objectives were very limited. It was to ensure border stability and security along the China-Myanmar border. As far as the strategy that the Chinese have adopted to achieve this goal is, I think, a continuation of the past, which is to emphasize non-interference in the internal affairs of Myanmar, and also to pursue some of the ethnic groups to reduce conflicts along the border. Just to highlight some events that kind of illustrate illustrate the point that I'm making here. Initially, the two countries began to more or less with the same tradition that they have followed up till 2011. Exchange of high-level visits. The first visit of President Thein Sein was China. China sent a high-level delegation to Myanmar. Then towards the end, I think 2011, September 2011, the major issue in the bilateral issue that emerged was the Metson Dam, which is a dam, Chinese-backed dam, which was suspended by the Myanmar government in September 2011. That, I think, has created, of course, bilateral tensions. China was very unhappy with the way the Burmese government has dealt with the Metson Dam. Now, this has followed very, subsequently by increasing American, involvement in Myanmar, particularly, the visit of Secretary Hillary Clinton, then followed by President Obama in 2012. I think at this point, the Chinese were worried that the conflicts, the problems in the borderlands might invite external players, including the Americans, to access the borderlands, as conflicts might, of course, attract human rights issues and as well as refugee crisis. So I think one of the concerns of the Chinese at this point was increasingly the geostrategic issues in the context of the ethnic conflicts in Myanmar. Now, in the second phase, actually, this started by when the Chinese started to look at the issue purely or very largely from the geostrategic prism. As I said, the growing U.S.-Myanmar relations, and the U.S., some of the ethnic groups, including Kachins, growing relations with the Americans, and of course the Japanese come in a big way and appointing a special envoy for the peace process in Myanmar. I think these again created anxiety in Beijing that they needed to step up their role in Myanmar. So the objectives that the Chinese adopted was to remind the Myanmar government, rather to position itself to play a leading role in the Myanmar ethnic conflicts, both the militarized part as well as the peace process in Myanmar. And the strategy, of course, is to remind the Burmese that about its position and power by using some of the ethnic groups. Maybe I'll just mention two events here. In 2015, Phuong Khai Sin, the leader of the Kokhan, returned to Myanmar, and a renewed conflicts emerged between the Kokhan and the Burmese army. Many believe that he was in China for 6 years. He was actually ousted in 2009 by another leader, Kokhan leader, and he returned after 6 years. And in between the 6 years and the groups of the Kokhan, many believe were supported by the Chinese, and they were being helped by the Chinese during that period. Then we also had the report of China supplying several helicopters to the United Wa State Army. This report, it's not verified. Both the Chinese and the United Wa State Army deny the allegation, but it again raised the question of the doubts about the Chinese role, genuine role of the Chinese in the Myanmar ethnic conflicts. Now, by late 2015 or mid 2015, Chinese dependence, as conflicts intensified in Myanmar-China border, the Burmese dependence on China to deal with the ethnic groups, ethnic conflicts, has only increased. And I think by this time, the Chinese began to calculate that they could use this to build a bridge to build goodwill with the opposition parties of the Burmese political parties. Remember that the NLD Aung San Suu Kyi's party was an opposition party during in 2015, and it was during this period that the Chinese tried to reach out to this group. Now, in the third phase, I think between 2016 and 18, Chinese concerns and interests were largely on the growing international focus or interest in what was happening in Myanmar, particularly regarding the Rohingya crisis. Now, I think, again, one of the objectives of the Chinese at this point was to build good relations. Remember that the Aung San Suu Kyi government came to power in early 2016, and it was during this period that relations between the two countries have improved, and also this coincided with increasing international criticism on the Burmese on the way it has handled the Rohingya crisis. Now, I think one of the strategy that the Chinese adopted at this point was to find some convergence of interest with the Burmese government, and the Rohingya crisis provided or presented itself as one such issue, to find convergence of interest with the Burmese government. Again, there are events, a lot of events that could be used to illustrate these points. One is, of course, the Chinese foreign minister becoming the first foreign leader to visit Myanmar after the Aung San Suu Kyi government took over power. Then the Chinese scale up its political financial support to Myanmar. Then it pressurized some of the ethnic groups to be part of the national ceasefire agreement. And of course, it protected Myanmar in the UNSC as far as the Rohingya issue is concerned. And we also saw a lot of projects, strategic projects being signed during this period. Now, so the point that I think this paper has identified three strategic factors, or is arguing that there are three strategic factors that have also played a role in shaping the Chinese interests or the Chinese approach to in the context of ethnic conflicts in Myanmar. Now, the first, of course, as I said, is to build goodwill. I think, as I said earlier, also there were several ways in which the Chinese have tried to build good relations, goodwill with the Myanmar government. They pressurized the ethnic groups, aligned its position with the Myanmar government on issues such as the Rohingya crisis, protected the Myanmar government in UN, UNSC, and also increased its role in supporting the peace process in Myanmar. I think the second point that this paper is making is that China desired to play a leading role in Myanmar's ethnic conflicts. Now, I think one of the concerns of the Chinese was that it has always, it was always wary of other players, particularly the United States, playing a bigger role in the conflict situations in Myanmar. Then, of course, the appointment of special envoy by the Chinese on the Myanmar, focusing on Myanmar's peace process, again, indicate that the Chinese wanted to play a leading role in the Myanmar ethnic conflicts. Then the third, I think, is the interest for pushing some of its strategic projects. So the Chinese have been able to use its role in protecting the Myanmar government, as well as in playing a role in the peace process in Myanmar to push through some of the strategic projects in Myanmar. Now, this slide shows the 5 major projects that China has been able to extract from Myanmar by playing its role in in managing the conflicts in Myanmar, as well as in protecting Myanmar in international, particularly in the UN. So I wouldn't go into detail, but the red, of course, is the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. And if you look at, in fact, all these MOUs that were signed in different times and separately. But if you put them in one place, you actually get, this and put them together, you actually get the Myanmar economy, China-Myanmar economic corridor in one place. Now, whether it's real, whether it's border economic cooperation zone, whether it's road highways, or whether it's the Chokfu deep sea port, all aligned along the China-Myanmar economic corridor. So, and look at the dates in when all these agreements have been, MOUs have been signed. It's all after 2016, when China was able to build that relationship with China, with Myanmar. Now, so what are the implications in as far as these issues are concerned? I think as far as Myanmar is concerned, since China engaged itself in the ethnic conflicts in Myanmar, we have seen a couple of new dimensions in Myanmar's ethnic conflicts. One is we have seen that there have been new political realignments and political alliances, and we have also seen new military alliances. The Northern Alliance, which includes 4 major ethnic armed groups, is one, which have come into being only in 2016. Then you have the federal political negotiation consultation committee, which is led by the United War State Army and involved 8 ethnic armed groups, also came into being in 2017. Then we also have a new dimension in terms of conflict zones, where for many years, places like Rakhine and Kachin State were not, the key areas of conflicts as far as the Myanmar government and the ethnic groups are concerned. Suddenly, you see that the Arakan army, for instance, started to spread its militarized conflicts in areas like Rakhine and the Kachin State, and that conflict has been growing in recent years. Now, as far as India is concerned, I think there are 2 major implications. One, of course, is that with China now able to push through major, strategic projects in Myanmar, China might want to involve other players, other countries, particularly countries like Bangladesh, into the under the BRI. The BRI initiative. The fact that Bangladesh also is part of the joined the BRI, the Chinese might want to involve other countries, and particularly Bangladesh. Now, the other, I think, implication is strategic and security. I think with major important strategic projects coming up around Chokfu port, China might want to securitize these projects, and that will have huge implications, long-term implications for India, particularly when we see these in the context of the larger picture, where China is building other ports and corridors in Pakistan and in Sri Lanka. Now, as far as China-US rivalry is concerned, I think as far as the US-China interaction in Myanmar is concerned, I believe that this will remain problematic because with the ethnic conflicts not likely to be resolved in the near future, that will remain problematic. But I feel that again, because as the rivalry intensifies, that might give some room of maneuver for Myanmar, and we have already seen that in the Chokfu deep sea port renegotiation, where the Americans have helped the Burmese to renegotiate a better deal with the Chinese. Now, in the conclusion, let me just say this. I think from the study, there are 3 trends that could be discerned from the Chinese role or response to the Myanmar ethnic conflicts. One is, I think, the level of Chinese role in ethnic in conflict situation will be determined by the degree of its strategic interests. Now, the second is China's involvement in conflicts is driven less by the desire to solve the problem, but it's driven more by its desire to use it for its own strategic interests. Then the third, I believe, is that the Chinese would prefer to lead and seek Asian solutions, and probably that will guide its approach in other conflict situations in the region. As far as the future of Myanmar, China is concerned, the question I pose here is, has China succeeded in achieving its geostrategic goals? I believe yes. I think the fact that it has been able to extract some of the strategic projects from Myanmar suggests that it has been able to, by using the ethnic conflicts there, it has been able to push some of its interests in Myanmar. But my sense is that, the relationship is not sustainable because in the Myanmar case, what happens is that their foreign policy and domestic politics are intertwined. So what happens is their foreign policy is heavily dependent on the political changes inside, and political leaders may what foreign policy choices political leaders make are designed to seek political legitimacy inside. So if that's the case, you cannot rule out a scenario where these things will unravel in the near future. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think the paper raises a number of questions, but to me it seems that there are two interesting sort of trajectories that one can envision here about the research and about the project. One is we are all in the midst of trying to assess the rise of China and its implications. And so I think the fundamental question that we often pose ourselves, those who study China and those who study its implications, is what are the sources of Chinese behavior? So I think when you look at China operating in a certain manner in its periphery, you have to ask the question, what is driving that? Whether it's a domestic political discourse or domestic political proclivities within the Chinese state, the sort of political structures, the leadership roles of individuals within China, or is it something more fundamental? As powers rise, there's geostrategic interests evolve, and whether that is driving Chinese behavior in the periphery. And I think that's a fundamental question Yhome is posing as part of this project by focusing on Myanmar and what the role of China has been on Myanmar. The other, of course, is the Myanmar question itself, as how that Myanmar question has evolved. Myanmar is an important partner of India. As India looks towards the east more and more, as India tries to envision a new role for itself in the Bay of Bengal community, as India tries to move, sort of links itself more with the Southeast and Southeast Asia, I think Myanmar is an integral part of this reimagination. So we should be aware of how Myanmar is dealing with its internal problems and how Myanmar is relating to other outside powers. And I think in that sense also it raises certain questions about Myanmar's behavior vis-a-vis its fellow major powers in the region. So I would now like to invite Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya for his comments, and then I will take the floor to Professor Bhalla.
Thank you, Professor Pant. First of all, I would like to thank the ORF for this invitation and you for presiding over this discussion paper. And of course, it's a great honor to be sharing the podium with Professor Madhu Bhalla on this occasion. I would also like to congratulate Yhome for, I think, an excellent paper. I've had the benefit of commenting on an earlier draft of it, so perhaps there is not much left for me to actually critique, because I think all the points have been very well taken on board. And really now for me it is more a matter of maybe filling in some details or adding some sort of personal perspective to the general arguments that have been made. And the general arguments, I think the most important point that he has made, and that's self-evident, I think he has pressed it, is to say that this is not simply done by benign or anodyne concerns about security and stability on the Myanmar-China border. It is not also just a factor of channelizing or managing, nationalist sentiments. And I think within that I would also use a particular Yunnan sub-nationalist or sub-regional sentiment, which is very much driving this, which is not there in the body of the text, but it's very much there in the footnotes in his paper. And it is really, in fact, determined by strategic and geostrategic interests. It is sort of perhaps tempting to link this with the US, but I would say that it's even beyond that. Regardless of the US-China competition, China has evolved to a point of certain strategic interests, which really have to do with its influence in Asia and beyond Asia into the world. And so, while geostrategic interests are to some extent predicated on China and particularly the US, and that has been a very strong driving factor, I will say that there is an area of autonomy and even beyond that, where China is literally driven by, and I think this perhaps addresses the point just raised by Professor Pant, that it's actually driven by internal ambitions and compulsions, not compulsions as much as ambitions. Now, I'd like to sort of start, by picking on one point that you said, that which is basically that in many ways China's, so to say, third phase of its involvement in the ethnic crisis. And by the way, I must compliment you also on the historic background. It's brief but very accurate. Its involvement in the third phase of the ethnic conflict, its particularly activist phase, I would say, is very much driven by a desire to regain lost ground, ground that it lost during the reform process starting from 2011. Now, all of you will remember that this was when President Thein Sein came into power as a civilian government, but really, in a way, the reform phase of the military government, civilianized. And among the major initiatives that it took was internal political reform, the release of Aung San Suu Kyi, the launching of political reforms, greater political freedoms, media freedoms, and so on, which developed very much in the course of the time. Economic reforms, which involved opening up the economy, inviting foreign investment, liberalizing trade, a kind of unified, currency, and so on. And thirdly, a kind of major diplomatic outreach. So in those 3 or 4 years, Myanmar really expanded its diplomatic representation, its diplomatic relations, and in a way, actually rehabilitated itself in the international community. Many of the international sanctions were finally reversed. And it was just about becoming a completely normal state in Asia. In fact, at a time when democracy was suffering jolts elsewhere in the world, Myanmar somehow stood up as a kind of shining example in November 2015, when they conducted, actually for all practical purposes, reasonably free and fair elections, and the results were actually upheld in contrast to what had happened many years back. It was a kind of shining example, almost a beacon of democracy, not just in the world, but particularly in Asia. So there was a sense that in this diplomatic opening, China was being marginalized. And in fact, the Chinese government, the Myanmar government at that time, the USDP government, was acutely conscious. And frankly, I have also never seen, and in my interactions with the Chinese, which were several during that period, the Chinese acknowledged actually a kind of discomfiture with the way the Myanmar government had actually kept the Chinese government a little on the back foot. In fact, I can't think of any other country, big or small, that had actually managed to keep China so much on the back foot, unless one, then comes back to the latest sort of Trump administration and its trade war. So it was remarkably successful. And that was also one of the reasons why, many things happened. You have mentioned some of the incidents, the KIA, the Kokang conflict, but in many ways a kind of signature or signpost of that was the failure, partial failure of the nationwide ceasefire agreement in October 2015. In fact, the nationwide ceasefire agreement had been initialed by all 15 insurgent groups, ethnic armed organizations as they call them, that were negotiating the NCA. And it was only in the final moments that only 8 eventually signed, and 7 did not sign. And all the 7 were in fact countries that were very much within the sphere of influence. If you look at the map that he has, you will find that all the southern insurgent groups actually signed, and it was only those that bordered the Myanmar border, except for two organizations, the Kokang MNDA and the Arakan Army, with whom the Chinese had never actually entered into negotiations because they did not have bilateral ceasefires. I mean, the Chinese insistence was that you have to first sign a bilateral ceasefire before you sign a nationwide ceasefire. And these two organizations, they had not yet signed a bilateral ceasefire. So they, I mean, this was one signal that they were uncomfortable with the process. And by the way, that included the NSCNK, because the NSCNK also had ties, very indirect ties with the Chinese. In fact, that worked to our advantage because we were invited as observers to the signing of the nationwide ceasefire agreement. It would have put us in a very piquant situation if the NSCNK had also been a signatory, because then we would have been observing and somehow endorsing it in some form or the other. It worked out convenient for us that it didn't happen. And remember, this was soon after, not long after the June 18 ambush and so to say retaliatory strike conducted by the Indian Army after that. So they were very much aware, they were very much on the back foot, and the USDP government was very much aware that they had the Chinese on the back foot. And in fact, a lot of the complaints that you described about the negotiating team, their attitudes to China reflected in Min Aung's comments were very, very palpable at that time. There was a very great impatience with the Myanmar at that point. The second point is, of course, that this entire peace process was heavily somehow West supported. The Myanmar Peace Center, which was created to conduct these negotiations, led by a minister in the President's office, Yhome, actually adopted very unconventional, very informal, very innovative methods to reach out and to build confidence with the insurgent groups. Personally going to conflict-affected areas, risking their personal security, in fact, not standing on protocol and ceremony, and actually meeting these groups in Chiang Mai, things that I think our government would find extremely difficult to do, just from a political point of view. But Aung Min and the Myanmar Peace Center, they did three things actually. One is that they used very informal, very aggressive, very PR means to engage the ethnic insurgent groups and to develop a trust and confidence, including drinking with them in their own lairs and so on. The second one was to really bring in the best expertise possible, particularly within the Myanmar community, including Myanmar, who had been experienced in handling conflicts and so on in places like Afghanistan. Min Aung, who himself was a case like that, but also bringing on board former rebels like the All Burma Students Front, one of whose representatives, Ong Nangu, I think it's Ong Nangu, was a very prominent member of the negotiating team. And the third was in being able to get Western funding to be able to support the very high salaries of the, actually they paid very well to keep the MPC going. So at that point, I actually remember when the elections took place, perhaps the most important figure in President Thein Sein's cabinet telling me, now let us see how she handles China. Because there was a very clear sense that she would not be able to handle China. In fact, one of the things that the Myanmar USDP government did quite unfairly, actually below the belt, was that they had been negotiating the Chofu, not the deep sea port, but the special economic zone, for 2-3 years before that. And the tender for that had been awarded, and the tender for that had been won by basically a Chinese consortium led by CITIC. And that consortium included the CP group from Thailand. It included, of course, people from Myanmar. And they did not actually approve this tender while they were formally in power. That is, not before the November 2015 election. But in the interim period between the election and the formal handing over power to the NLD government in April 2016, in January 2016, they steamrolled the award of the tender to the Chinese through the Myanmar parliament while they still had their majority in the parliament. And it was actually done, even if it means hurting themselves in the long run, it was actually done to sort of destabilize the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi in the process. So I think, this whole effort to regain lost ground, and I think Yhome has also talked about, the entry that that the Americans and the Japanese had made through Sasakawa and the Nippon Foundation. And of course, the Chinese were extremely uncomfortable, and apart from getting a leadership role, one of the primary motivations in their involvement was to keep the West out of the China-Myanmar borders. And they felt that whether it was humanitarian, or it was the peace process, or it was funding, or it was even development funding, these were the ways that the Americans and the West and the European Union would actually come much closer to their borders. Now, at this point, I want to, on the question of the ethnic armed groups, once again, I completely agree with Yhome that solving the ethnic crisis was never the intention or the objective of China's interest in the peace process. In fact, China's interest in the peace process was always strategic, and strategic in the sense of also restarting many of their strategic projects. I wouldn't say the Mitsun Dam was a strategic project, but they had an agreement for a railway line to be constructed through Yunnan up to Mandalay and perhaps even beyond. That was signed in 2009 when in fact Yhome was the railway minister. That agreement lapsed in 2014 and lay dormant. But more particularly, their larger strategic ambition of having access to the Bay of Bengal. And I think almost everything, we pay a lot of attention to the CPEC, but the idea of the CMEC has been latent in Chinese strategic thinking for a very long time, and that they have pursued it really quite doggedly. The oil and gas pipeline were the first two elements of that. The special economic zone was the second element of that. The deep sea port was the third element of that. I have actually traversed much of the routes of the oil and gas pipeline in Shan State, and at points in that pipeline you see actually signs written in Myanmar but also in English at places asking the local population not to damage these friendship pipelines. In other words, not to sabotage them, because clearly they also sensed that there was going to be opposition to these projects. The point that that I have a close friend, Ambassador Suresh Goel, who I am happy to see here today, would bear this out. An observation by a very close China hand and friend of ours in the Foreign Service, who said that the Chinese are masters of cultivating an inbuilt tension in even their closest of relations, which they can flex as and when they wish. And the use of the ethnic peace process has been a classical and skillful case of the Chinese using these inbuilt tensions to be able to advance their interests. Today, we are in a position, I think Yhome again listed out the various sort of agreements and strategic agreements and also projects that they have extracted or obtained from the NLD government, the Myanmar-China Economic Corridor, the border cooperation zones, the expressway, the railway, two expressways, the railway lines, the deep sea port, to which I would add also the special economic zone. In fact, the special economic zone, soon after all this started, the leading Myanmar businessman who was involved with the CITIC in this actually came to me and said, look, for us, the special economic zone is too small. We want to expand this to a whole series of north-south and east-west infrastructure projects, and we know that if we do it alone, it will elicit a lot of negative international attention. So we are interested in getting American, European, and Indian partners to be part of this project so that it is much more acceptable to the world at large. Interesting and significant was that they did not include Japan as one of the potential partners in this. So they have actually used this, and I think this is evident. You have spelt it out on the way the Northern Alliance was created, on the sudden appearance of the MNDAA. I would even say not much attention has been cast light on this, but one should keep open the option that the sudden appearance of the AA in Rakhine State, almost together with the ARSA, and initially the AA was confined to Kachin State, and they were extremely umbilically tied to the KIA. But suddenly, out of the blue, just around the end of 2015-16, the AA made its appearance in Rakhine State as well. And in fact, there has been a surprising degree of understanding between the ARSA and the AA. I'm not implying or imputing anything, but perhaps just a coincidence. But in fact, the ARSA and AA have not targeted each other, though the AA is very much a kind of Rakhine nationalist project in much the same way as I mean, their interests don't really coincide with the Rohingya. So, so there's one point, this whole question, I think I subscribe to the view that Aung San Suu Kyi made a very major strategic mistake by prioritizing the peace process and that too publicly, and also adopting methods and a strategy that was very different from the USDP government. By so doing, actually, she permitted the Chinese to get a very deep entry into Myanmar's domestic priorities. And after that, she became extremely dependent on the Chinese playing a positive role with the Northern Alliance, with the sort of ethnic armed organizations in the north, to bring them to the table to negotiate, which of course China did to some extent, always hiding its larger hand. But I would say that had she been more politically savvy, the first priority she should have attached would have been to economic development and economic growth. At that time, the whole world was ready to do anything and give anything to China as the kind of poster girl or poster boy of democracy. And in fact, that was what the large majority of the Myanmar also wanted. They wanted, along with freedom, along with democracy, democracy really translated to them in terms of betterment of their economic opportunities. And by not making this the priority, perhaps not at the expense of the peace process, but to continue the peace process as it had been conducted earlier, she would have both created the kind of political capital that would have been helpful to her for the peace process, but also preempted a kind of Chinese grip on its domestic priorities. And in terms of implications, I think once again, Yhome has done well to highlight its security implications for India, which are not only a much greater influence in Myanmar's affairs, but also the complete justification that it would give, particularly if the deep sea port, gas pipeline, special economic zone, oil pipeline, all come together, and the expressways all come together at Chofu. The justification it would give to China to securitize the Bay of Bengal. Now, this is something that we have been aware of and we have been highlighting, but it's been startling that the strategic community so far has not, perhaps on the kind of much greater story on the CPEC and what happens westward, the strategic community has not actually grabbed. This is of fundamental importance, and I think to the extent that you have called attention to this, I think your paper has done sort of a very important service to the strategic community. So I think I've said enough. I'm sure there are questions of details which can be discussed in the Q&A. But once again, congratulations and thank you, ORF, for the invitation.
Can I now invite Professor Bhalla for her comments?
And good evening, everybody. It's 4 o'clock. Can you hear me? Right. Thank you for asking me to come and speak on this very interesting paper. I must say that although I look at China, I don't look at Myanmar very, very closely. And this paper and the one that you wrote before, which I also looked at incidentally, sort of widened my view of what China is doing actually in the region. In that sense, I think the paper, as Ambassador also said, I think has done a great job of putting the evidence together and actually making a very strong argument for China's actions and its intentions in the region. My concern with the paper, though, and I'm going to be a little bit critical here, is really how we perceive China in the region and how we perceive actually through this paper what is China's framework for action in the region. I have a sense that if we look very narrowly at China's actions in Myanmar, especially in relation to the armed groups and to the peacemaking process, I think we are missing out on the larger picture of China's very clearly defined periphery policy. And I think this relates not just to Myanmar, it also relates to other countries which China sees on its periphery, which are troublesome and which have the potential to create instability for China and take its attention away from economic development and economic initiatives. Now, in that periphery policy, and this is quite interesting, China has actually sort of framed it along 3 or 4 principles. And you know, the Chinese always sort of frame these in sort of very kind of normative principles. But you can see the intentions behind these, right? So there's Qin, for example, that's closeness, right? There's Chang, which is earnestness. There's Hui, which is inclusiveness. And there is Rong, which is benefit, okay? So if you look at closeness, earnestness, inclusiveness, and benefit, all of these 4 principles actually apply to what China is doing in Myanmar, right? And at different times, each principle has been very significant for the Chinese. At some points, some principles haven't worked, like closeness hasn't worked in, say, phase 2 of the Myanmar policy. Earnestness has rarely actually ever worked because Chinese strategic intent has been behind what China does there. So in one sense, however, that's the way the Chinese foreign policy makers in China actually perceive what they're doing in Myanmar. So for the Chinese, it's a win-win situation, as they say. You know, if Myanmar is getting something from the China, if China is getting something from Myanmar, Myanmar is getting something from the Chinese, and that's a rationalization for policy as it works out. But the interesting part, of course, is that in some senses, within that periphery policy, China also sort of focuses on regional and sub-regional cooperative security. That doesn't work out for China everywhere, and certainly it has not worked out for China in Myanmar, it seems to me, despite its being able to get people to the peacemaking process, right? Because China has been very loath, in many ways, and the paper says as well, to keep the external world out of what is happening in Myanmar, especially in the peacemaking process. But ironically, and this is something that Myanmar has done very well, it has used its asymmetry of power with China to be able to be more flexible in the way in which it has acted during this period, and especially during the 2015 period and the first phase and the second phase period. So we are looking at China as not just somebody who has complete leeway in what it does in Myanmar, but certainly a China who is also constricted by the way in which Myanmar has acted strategically and in its own interest during these years. And I think that's a very interesting case study to see how smaller countries in the region have actually been able to meet their objectives partially or fully while engaging with much larger powers in the vicinity. And that, I think, has been, and Yhome says that in his paper, has been also Myanmar's concern about being wedged in between 2 large powers. So the ability of the Myanmaris, whether it was a junta or whether it was present government, to be able to actually work with larger governments while it has much less power, and to be able to involve the rest of the world in balancing of China and other larger powers like India, for example, I think is actually quite commendable and quite interesting to look at. And so for those of us who study China's foreign policy, and we constantly are reading about China's rise and its ability to influence, Asia, the world, we actually do see that there are a lot of constraints on China's foreign policy, its intentions, its strategic objectives. The other interesting thing, I think, and something I didn't see in the paper, was the extent to which the current conflict in Myanmar has actually its roots in majority Buddhist nationalism, right? And this is not a new issue, I think, in Southeast Asia. If you think of Myanmar as part of Southeast Asia, we have majority nationalism in Malaysia for the Malays. We have majority Sinhala Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka. So in a sense, it's something that is part of the region, this kind of majority nationalism that actually is very destructive of pluralism within societies and within nations. And part of the problem that we see in Myanmar today is a reluctance to recognize that perhaps a more federal structure in terms of power sharing and resource sharing and economy sharing would be more productive in terms of creating peace. So that absence of any discussion on any debate on federalism in Myanmar seems to me to be the crux of the issue. So as long as this issue doesn't come onto the table, there really is actually not going to be a solution in Myanmar. But none of this actually is being discussed by China, for which of course federalism is a completely unacceptable situation within China itself and outside as well, and it's not being discussed even by the Myanmarese, whether it was a junta or whether it is a new NLD government. Now, one of the consequences of that is, right, and this is quite interesting, that nowhere have I come, not in your paper, nor not in any other reading on the peacemaking process, the contribution of the ASEAN to peacemaking in Myanmar. The ASEAN has a long record of actually, peacemaking. It did that in Indonesia to begin with, and that's really one of its attributes to begin with. It did that in Indonesia, and it also did that with the HA problem. So it has actually been very effective in bringing people to the warring groups to the table. It has been very effective in actually walking through a solution and in actually contributing to peacemaking in the region. And yet the ASEAN, and Myanmar has been a part of the ASEAN for some time. The ASEAN has actually protected Myanmar in the early days under the junta, and there is no credible reason why the Myanmarese would not turn to the ASEAN in this situation. So that's one question that sort of comes up. When you talk about peacemaking, peacekeeping, where is ASEAN on this? Because technically Myanmar is a part of Southeast Asia. The other thing that actually I find quite interesting in this paper is that, in a sense, I think if you look at China, again, very narrowly in terms of what it's doing in Myanmar, we tend to forget that some of the pressures on China in terms of the development of its western provinces actually act out in this situation. Yunnan, of course, one of its poorer western provinces. But the other thing that actually works out in this is the fact that China is unable to actually control local level officials in how they act vis-a-vis ethnic groups across the border, vis-a-vis economic interests across the border, especially in the narcotics trade, especially in the logging trade. If you fly into Kunming, and I'm sure some of you have done that, one of the things that strikes you is the amount of deforestation in Yunnan. Right? Now, this is something that China has stopped because of its commitment to environmental change, to climate change, and the very strict policy on reforestation and on opposing deforestation plays into it prohibits Yunnanese from actually deforesting their own lands, but they have moved into Myanmar, and there's huge logging and deforestation that goes on in the northern reaches of Myanmar. And one of the, recently I think, or maybe it was 2 years ago, there was a huge armed clash between Chinese loggers and the Myanmarese military. So we are looking at actually sub-regional economic practices that create conflict on the borders. And part of that arises from the inability of the Chinese state sitting in Beijing to control provincial level officials and provincial level economic interests. This also has to do with the way in which narcotics trading and narcotics have been pushed back, opium farming has been pushed back into Myanmar by the Yunnanese operators, despite the fact that the Myanmarese army made some rather interesting strides on this issue. So I think that if we look at the sub-regional sub-official elements in the region, we get a very interesting picture of how China's larger geostrategic interests are actually constrained by many of these situations. And that despite the fact that China would like to have a more peaceable and stable border, its own provincial policies do not allow that to happen. The other, I think, thing that we might want to look at, going forward on this paper, is why does the U.S. pivot destabilize the region? Right? I think Yhome has said that the U.S. pivot has destabilized the region. That's what China thinks, right?
That's what China.
Yeah, but the U.S. pivot, for all of its great appearance on the geostrategic scene of Asia, of the Asia Pacific, really is not something that is of any significance today. I do not think that in 2017, 2018, 2016, the US pivot is actually an issue of debate in this part of Asia at least. One, because of course Trump has retreated from many of his international engagements. Although the American Navy has put more ships into the Indo-Pacific, it is not the Bay of Bengal area or this region that it's actually looking at. Interestingly, I do not think that within China there is now a debate on the US pivot to Asia. So I think those concerns have been put aside. These are now sort of redundant concerns as far as the Chinese are concerned. But what they are concerned about is being actually obstructed in their BRI initiative. And the BRI initiative really for them is joining the dots. They have joined the dots on the map that you showed. Finally, when you join the dots, you see the whole scheme, right? But initially, they were separate initiatives in this region. So this is something that they're scared of. And the other thing is because they've invested in the BRI. I mean, the BRI is now part of the Chinese constitution, right? So in a sense, Xi Jinping has invested his own career, in a sense, and his own reputation in that. It also defines the Chinese state. I mean, once you put it in the constitution, it defines a state. So really, if this is a state that is going to be connected with Asia in many of its own, through many of its own initiatives, that connection has to be a stable one, right? So there is therefore a larger geostrategic purpose to the BRI in terms of how China is to be viewed or views itself in its engagements with the world. This is a network China along the BRI. It's not network just with commerce and people and movements and migrations. It is networked through its economy. So this, I think this element adds this very fundamental, and I think you made a point, you made that argument. It makes a very fundamental sort of, argument for why China would seek to make sure that its investments and its initiative goes forward smoothly. And that's a fundamental reason, of course. But the interesting part, I think, is that in its periphery policy, when China talks about regional security cooperation, right, that's the element that's actually missing from its engagement with Myanmar. Right? This engagement is not a security engagement. This is a geostrategic engagement, and the military aspect is will actually fundamentally come through when China gains entry into its ports, when the ports are actually operational. So in a sense, that regional security cooperation that is part of its periphery policy does not apply to Myanmar at all. Myanmar is not in a position, the world is not in a position to take on this situation right now. If anybody has fears about China's presence in the Bay of Bengal, it is India. And it's India not just because of what is happening in Myanmar, it's also because of what may happen in Bangladesh. So really the Bay of Bengal region, and I think if you look at the map, you will see that within the Bay of Bengal region, we have some very important ports of our own. Right? A lot of our commerce comes through those ports and through that region. So we have sufficient anxieties, based on these concerns to want to look at what is happening in Myanmar very, very closely. And I think that in your implications for India, that comes out very, very, very clearly. Right? There's something I was sort of intrigued about in this paper. which is that you sort of talked about the Rohingyas as part of the general scheme of things in terms of ethnic divisions and ethnic rivalries and conflict. I'm sort of wondering whether in today's situation it is significant to just keep the Rohingya out of your discussion and to just merge it into the general discussion on conflict in Myanmar, right? And the reason I sort of say that is because the Rohingya incident has impacted on the reputation of Aung San Suu Kyi. There have been calls across the world in various places to take the Nobel Peace Prize away from her. And I'm not very sure how she is going to regain that reputation and be able to deal with the rest of the world when problematic issues arise in Myanmar and in the region. The other thing, of course, is the Rohingya refugee crisis involves Bangladesh directly into the politics of Myanmar. It not only involves Bangladesh, it also involves India much more directly because of our position A on refugees, B on the fact that we have Rohingya refugees in India, and also because the Bangladeshis have asked us to talk about this issue to the Myanmaris. So, I sort of wondering whether you can factor that into your discussion in terms of the larger sort of conversation on security in the region. Not so much geostrategic imperatives, but security in the region. So when we talk about civil strife, when we talk about internal domestic strife, I don't think that we can leave Rohingyas out of this as the Rohingya consideration out of this conversation. So that's something I was wondering, thinking about. And of course, linked to that is the Buddhist nationalism that is, a problem within Myanmar itself. So I think we have to link the Myanmar thing to other nationalist issues in Myanmar so that we have an idea of what directions perhaps Myanmar will be able to take and what kind of conversations about security people in South Asia can actually have with Myanmar. The last thing, and I want to say this really is, you said that China is looking for Asian solutions to the Myanmar issue. I'm not sure there is an Asian solution to anything, right? And for the reason that I do not think that there is in Asia any one way of looking at a solution. If China says it needs an Asian solution, what it is saying is it wants a Chinese solution, right? Because the conflation of Asia with China within China has become now very direct. So I think the Asian solution idea perhaps needs to be a little bit investigated. Whether in fact there are other Asian countries, is there Japan, is there India, is there China, is ASEAN coming in on this, and if at all there is an Asian solution to anything. I think this sort of harks back to the Asian values idea, which of course now sort of is highly debated and questionable. So thinking of a unity of solutions, a solution in terms of a unified solution, somehow doesn't actually work here, it seems to me. Asia is too fragmented. I think rising nationalisms, different geopolitical interests, highly competitive countries, it does not actually bode well for the idea of an Asian solution, it seems to me. So I think that's really what I want to say. Thank you.
Mr. Bhalla, and I think now let's open this up for conversation so that you can, I will give you the last word. The floor is now open for your questions, comments, and observations. You can direct your question to the presenter, or you can also direct your questions to the two speakers, who I hope won't mind responding to some of the queries if you have. Please do introduce yourself.
Yes. Hi, I'm Saket Ambarkhane. I was working in Myanmar for a while, for almost 2 years. I just want to understand, how do you see the role of the Myanmar army in all of this? Because that hasn't been talked, especially in terms of the Chinese involvement with with these peace process and other things that China is doing, because particularly with the army, especially in the northern areas, how I mean, from what I have understood, there's a personal resolve within the army to absolutely finish some of the groups. I mean, they are literally pushing them. So how do you see the role of the army in particular in terms of Chinese involvement in Myanmar?
No more questions, is it? Nobody wants to engage?
So why don't you start with I think there are lots of comments being made both from the two discussants.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the question that has been asked. I think as far as the military's role is concerned, I think, despite the fact that Myanmar today has quasi-civil democratic government, I think the military still remains the key as far as the ethnic conflicts are concerned. And I think I agree with you that the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, has certainly have their own strategy in dealing with different ethnic groups. Let's say, for instance, I think the Northern Alliance today for the Burmese military, I think they see the Northern Alliance and the United War State Army, I think, as the key challenge in any peace process, in taking forward the peace process, and even in terms of dealing militarily. Yes, I think I would agree that the Burmese military perhaps want to have an upper hand militarily on at least some of the Northern Alliance groups, probably not the United War State Army, but because in terms of strength, I think they don't want to enter into a major conflict with the United War State Army, given the kind of capabilities that that group has. But I think with the other ethnic groups, particularly the Kachin, the Kokand, the Wa, perhaps their idea is to push them to the corner and probably then try to negotiate some started political negotiations with them. So finish them militarily and then start the political negotiations. I think that's what the strategy is. I think I thank you so much for the rich sort of comments on the paper. Given the the scope of the paper, I could not deal with some of the issues that both of you have raised. I think, Ambassador, you have raised excellent points. It's within the framework of the paper, and I more or less agree with whatever you have said. On the question of I'm not too sure if we have seen, you said, we have not seen the Arakan in the ASA kind of. If you look at the ASA's, let's say, strength, I'm not sure if they actually have that kind of a capability to fight the Arakan army. And I think their political objectives, the military objectives are quite clear. I don't think they want to get into any conflict at this point of time when they have a major, bigger challenge enemy that they have to deal with. And on the other issues, I think I completely agree with you. Ma'am, thank you. I think, I could have, broadened the framework and look at China from the peripheral perspective, policy that China has, and locate Myanmar in that larger framework. I think that's perfectly, and I agree with that. On the question of ASEAN's role, I think this is not the first time that ASEAN has not been able to play a major role in Myanmar. We have seen this since the 90s. Myanmar has been a problem for ASEAN in dealing with the issues that Myanmar has posed before the regional institution. Part of the problem could be the geostrategic location of Myanmar. I think with the fact that Myanmar is between the Asian giants, I think has also kind of limits ASEAN's role here, because if you look at the 90s, the military, during the military regime, the human rights violations, abuses, despite Aung San Suu Kyi's let's say support from the West, and ASEAN's wanting to play a role, we didn't see ASEAN able to push anything through there. And at that point also we saw how the Burmese military has used, or rather built their relationship with China to kind of push back some of those initiatives. Again, now on Rohingya issue, Rohingya issue, I think for ASEAN also it has its own problems, because initially, if you remember, Indonesia and Malaysia, they did raise this issue, and when the migrants issue came up sometime in 2015. Then in 2017, when the refugee crisis was blown out, there were voices from ASEAN, but I think institutionally, ASEAN itself see itself as being constrained in dealing with this. One of the issue is that all these ASEAN countries, particularly Indonesia and Malaysia, they already have certain amount of Rohingya refugees, migrants there. And I'm not too sure if anyone wants to take more Rohingyas. And the moment you talk about it, I think the problem is that people want to put the problem on you. So I think that problem, constraint limitation, is also there on all the ASEAN countries. And on the, again, I agree with the Yunnan provincial government role. You would remember that China came up with this Go West strategy, and it's very much part of that strategy that China is pursuing now. But I've mentioned in my paper that as Myanmar's strategic value increases for Beijing, I'm not too sure how much of the role and importance Yunnan will play as far as China's Myanmar policy is concerned, because the kind of strategic projects that China is building now, increasingly the decisions will be taken from Beijing, not from Yunnan province. In the 90s, up until the 90s, I think Yunnan, and even before that, Yunnan was very important in deciding for China's policy as far as Myanmar is concerned. I think that's going to change probably, as we see things, these projects get built. I agree on the ASEAN. The Asian solution. I've also used inverted commas to say that yes, I completely agree. It's a Chinese solution, but I've used that to say that this is how the Chinese want to project their role in conflict situations in the region.
So before, I think I'll give the final word to the ambassador here, but before that, any other questions, comments before we just make the final? Okay, yes.
Hello, my name is Himanshu Martulia and I am pursuing political science from Delhi University. So my question to you is, India, despite not being the signatory to the UN Refugee Convention of 1951, still India has accommodated many refugees, whether we talk about the Dalai Lama and his followers when came to India, or refugees from Afghanistan and other countries. My question to you is that why, how do you assess the decision of the government of India of not opening the doors for the refugees, the Rohingya refugees, as they opened for the other refugees?
Okay, I think I'll come to that question, but maybe I could just respond to, I think, some of the points raised by Professor Bhalla as well as the one raised by you. As far as the Myanmar army is concerned, I think it's very clear that they want to negotiate from a position of strength. It is extremely committed to the whole idea of the national integrity of Myanmar. it is very committed to the idea that all these border regions should be brought back within Myanmar influence. In fact, the WA is a particular case, an aberration, because unlike WA and also Mongla, unlike Kachin State and Kokang, where they actually have their very much central presence, these areas they virtually do not have. They're economically, you can say, or semi-politically, they're already part of China. They're completely in China's orbit, and so on. So I think their idea is to at least those groups that they can keep within the Myanmar sort of political structure, or actually territorial integrity, to try and press their advantage, get better terms for the negotiations. I think that's basically the point. I think the rest also Yhome has answered. I think Professor Bhalla has raised some very interesting points, though I do feel that in many ways some of them are questions of detail, and like the ASEAN issue, the Asian solutions and so on. I mean, the point that you make about Buddhist nationalism and the point about federalism, I think that goes into the root causes of the Myanmar conflict, not so much of the Chinese involvement. But I think in terms of the root causes, that is very, very important. The fact is that both the Myanmar army, and this also touches on your question, as well as Myanmar as a whole, see a conflate really Buddhist nationalism, territorial integrity, and the role of the army very much together. And there is very much a kind of Burma majoritarian sentiment that is just a mirror image of Han majoritarian sentiment. In many ways, Myanmar is as ethnocentric as the Han Chinese are, and they are reflections of the same kind of nationalism. Same with the US pivot. I think it is true that Trump has simply no interest in Myanmar, probably does not even know where Myanmar is, in contrast to a really strong interest pursued by the Obama administration. Actually, I don't even know again how involved Obama was, but certainly his visit was a very important event. But Clinton and I think the Democratic Party establishment, including Ambassador Derek Mitchell, were very, very committed to the idea of moving ahead. And also don't forget that actually the Kachins had a very close relationship with both the British and the Americans during the Second World War. And culturally, also because of religion, also because of the spread of Christianity, the Kachins feel a sense of kinship and affinity with the United States, which is why Gurmore wasted no time in actually visiting the US. And of course, that was also one of the reasons why the Chinese reacted to the whole Kachin issue. The Rohingya issue is, I think a little unrelated to this, because it has to do, I think, really with, with the status of Muslims as a whole in India at the moment. If you see the what is it called, the Citizenship Amendment Bill, it accepts refugees from every other community except the Muslims. So the Rohingya issue is very much linked to the whole question of the status of Muslims in India in the BJP, or let's say RSS worldview. Now that's a totally separate subject. I think it is not at all related to the issue that we have. But the issue that we have is, and I think Yhome has done that, shown that very clearly, that once again, after having negotiated a considerable distance, negotiated a way out of the Chinese grip, the Rohingya issue has now once again pushed back in the Myanmar back into the Chinese grip, and once again fairly solidly, because in a way it has helped them extract all the strategic projects, pursue the BRI ambitions. And once again, I think I'd like to thank Professor Bhalla for projecting the BRI as a kind of independent, autonomous impulse of the Chinese establishment at this point of time, particularly during Xi Jinping's leadership. So I think that has been the case. And of course, that raises the whole question about what kind of strategy we should have, or we can have in this context. I don't think I can go into that, because that would be a subject of another lecture. But I would just say that India has tried to play the game by being as pro-Myanmar government. In this case, there is no great contradiction between the Myanmar government, the Burma people, and the Myanmar army in, responding to the Rohingya issue. By and large, we have taken a pro-Myanmar army, government, Burma position, and this has, arguably played out quite well in the Myanmar establishment. But there is a sense in Myanmar that once again they are falling back into the Chinese grip, and that India is not doing enough. And in fact, other countries, whether it is Singapore or countries in the ASEAN, Thailand, or particularly Japan, Korea, even Australia are doing much more. And now, that feeling is there. Question again, for the last point raised by Yhome was sustainability of the Chinese initiative. I think the Chinese initiative has to be mindful that, they are dealing with a highly nationalistic Burma majority. And just as there were reactions to Chinese presence in the 60s and 70s, there is a possibility of a Myanmar reaction to Chinese dominance or Chinese infiltration, including demographic, in places like Mandalay in the future. So I'm not sure that this is a straightforward strategic win for China. I think there are still there are still things to be played out. It's very early in the stage. It's not that India has no options. The question is whether India knows what options it has and can act on it. Thank you.
So with that, let me close this session. It's, as you can see, there are a range of issues here which impinge on India, which impinge on the region, which impinge on Chinese behavior in our periphery, and which impinge on both some of the more more policy relevant questions, as well as some of the conceptual issues, some of the academic discourse that Yhome has highlighted in his paper. So with that, thank you Yhome, thank you Professor Bhalla, thank you Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, and thank you all for joining us today, and keep joining us for future sessions as well. Please join us for tea as well. Thank you.